Just as a warning, I come from a Muslim tradition, so if I know the Arabic names for religious figures better than English or Latin ones, so we might have to work through that sometimes. But my main question is on, it revolves around two cases, and it's essentially the possibility of forgeries and addition in the Bible and what the ramifications are in that for Christian belief. And if it's okay, I'll just like to give like sort of some background on the two things I'm thinking of. The first one is the disciple Paul wrote 27 letters in the Bible called the Pauline letters. And 6 of those we know for a fact were written by the disciple Paul. But some of the others we're not sure of and we think might be forgeries. The one that comes instantly to mind is Ephesians. And what happens is, chronologically, we have all the letters of Paul. They go along, and Ephesians is in there between 2 other ones. And Ephesians has a completely different literary style, rhetorical style, and point than his other letters. We have essentially what would happen if Stephanie Meyer wrote Twilight, then wrote War and Peace, and then went back to Breaking Dawn. Just completely different rhetorical styles. And we had such great Christian thinkers as St. Augustine. We've had a pope or two. We've had several delegates from the Southern Baptist Conference say that there is a possibility that this is not a legitimate verse by the disciple Paul. While it might be good Christian teaching and good lessons, it might not be directly from Paul. And then my second case is the book of Ayub, I think Job in Latin, or Job in English, is that correct?
Job, yes.
Yes. In the story of Job, after Job experiences several really, really bad days, he breaks down and has a conversation with 3 of his neighbors. The first 2 neighbors have a fairly consistent point, but then there's a third one. And the third neighbor has an entirely different rhetorical point and an entirely different speaking style. And also, in all Bibles written before the year, I do not remember what exact year it was, but I believe it is in the early 1000s millennium, that third neighbor started appearing. And once again, we have several prominent Christian thinkers perhaps suggesting that maybe it was added in there somewhere. I'm just wondering if we believe in the authenticity of the Bible, the truth of Jesus, and the gospel, how do we dismiss those points? How do we adjust to those points? How do we know what to do?
First point is, I don't think there's any way that I could show you or anybody else that the Bible is the Word of God, so I wouldn't want to waste our time trying.
Fair enough.
Same way it's impossible to show the Quran is the Word of God. It's impossible to show that any book is the Word of God. It's impossible. Second point. When I speak in rescue missions in inner city, I can promise you I use radically different language than I'm using today at this fine university. So just because there's a difference in style doesn't mean that it's not the same person. In fact, Rudolf Bultmann, who demythologized the New Testament, the German biblical scholar, said, it's because of the different styles that I cannot accept the New Testament. Well, C.S. Lewis took those same tests, and here's what I was trying to do with the gentleman before you, to be consistent. Took the same tests that Rudolf Bultmann applied to the New Testament to show that they're different styles. And he came up with 5 different Rudolf Bultmanns who wrote what Rudolf Bultmann wrote. In other words, it's an unfair critique. It's being too precise. Third point, at the end of 2 Thessalonians, we read, I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand, which is the distinguishing mark in all my letters. This is how I write, implying that it's very possible that a secretary, an amanuensis, wrote previously 2 Thessalonians. How much influence did an amanuensis, a secretary, have? I do not know. But I can promise you, the reliability of Ephesians or 2 Thessalonians does not depend on Paul having written it all out. So it's just not that big an issue.
Well, I can agree with that just a simple change in style and rhetorical devices might not be important. But what I'm more concerned about is the difference in conclusion. If it was just a secretary writing in his own style, that's fine. However, if the secretary was writing in his own style and shifted a large point or a large conclusion, that has far greater consequences for
Sure.
biblical theory.
So what's the contradiction in the Pauline letters that so grieves you?
Actually, because I'm a Muslim, so I have not read those letters. I just read St. Augustine's critique, so I know it's there.
Yeah.
More specifically, I can go to Job because I know what the inconsistency, well, not inconsistency, but disagreement is there.
Well, what's the problem in Job?
The problem in Job, if I remember correctly, is and it is essentially that the first two neighbors, I believe, tell Job that his feelings are deserved, reasonable, and make sense. And however, the third gives a testimony far closer to God once he starts talking to Job. It's a far more what right do you have to question style thing. And that is a significantly different point, and there's significant evidence that it was added far later. So what we have is evidence of a added biblical verse that introduces a new point to an existing story, and that's troubling.
I can promise you I am not troubled in the slightest that Job's counselors had different perspectives. I would expect that.
It's not that they have different perspectives, it's that it seems as though an additional perspective might have been added in later, not without authenticity, because it was written so far after the fact.
All right. Well, the New International Version points out that John chapter 8, verses 1 through 11 are not in the earliest Greek manuscript. So you're right. The end of Mark chapter 16, John chapter 8, verses 1 through 11 are found in later manuscripts. So is it possible that those passages were not part of the original? Yes, it is possible. I don't have a humongous problem with that. I'm very grateful that we have that kind of specificity of the text, that we can make that kind of call.
So you don't believe that the possibility of editing the Bible and changing points within the Bible, if it is inspired by God, if a book inspired by God is later changed by man, that there's no risk of misinterpretation, changing of the point?
That is where I thought you were headed, and that's why I started out my answer with, there is no way that I could prove to you the Bible is the Word of God or the Quran. To try and maintain that any book is inspired by God is impossible to show. Okay? Now, does the evidence point to the New Testament being historically accurate? Absolutely yes. And I would encourage you to look at what I would consider the picayune nature of your objections to say, wow, the evidence is the text is very, very reliable.
It's not so much historical accuracy that I'm worried about, because I believe that's a reasonable account of perhaps not. I think most people can agree, even secularists like me can agree that for the most part the Bible is an accurate reflection of the political history of the Israelites. However, there's this large difference between verifiable historical fact and using the Bible as a basis for morality. And if people can add verses to the Bible, and the Bible is a basis for morality, then the possibility of additions, specifically moral additions to the Bible, is significantly important because so many people use it as a moral basis.
Yeah, but when you study the text and you study the manuscripts, the evidence is we have what they wrote back in the first century. We have an incredibly accurate presentation of the Gospels. We have about over 5,200 Greek manuscripts or pieces of manuscript dated from the 2nd through the 10th century AD, all agreeing to an infinitesimal degree. Let's be consistent. There is no document from antiquity that can even approach the New Testament Gospels in manuscript evidence.
Well, Perhaps, but that's also because there's so many of them. But that, I get back to my point that we have two examples, both in Ephesians and in the book of Job, that there's possibility of significant changes both to writing style and conclusions that are added. And this is at least seen as reasonable by such people as St. Augustine, who I consider to be a fairly significant biblical figure. Well, not biblical figure, but biblical scholar.
What does Ephesians and Job change? If Ephesians and Job were not in the canon, what would that change?
I believe there are some moral lessons in Ephesians. So if that was not accurate, then that is significant. And
there is nothing different in Ephesians. Nothing. You got Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy. And if you were to take Ephesians out, that would change nothing. It doesn't contradict anything.
But because, fortunately or unfortunately, people do use the Bible to cherry pick moral ideas, even a small change, like even if the book of Ephesians as a whole, if removed, does not change the point, even slight verses can have an immense impact. And even more than that, it's just the fact that things can be added. So it brings question to the concept of absolute morality in the Bible. Even if there is an absolute morality, if it's not directly and inerrably given to us in the Bible due to editing and additions, then even if there is an absolute morality, maybe not, then we won't know it because the Bible, which you would believe would be the way to find that out, misinterprets. So we misinterpret the Bible, we misinterpret the Word of God, we misinterpret absolute morality, and that's bad.
Job and Ephesians change nothing.
But it is the concept that things can be changed in a book that's supposed to be absolute.
You see, sir, and that's my problem with you. It's right where I started, sir. So quit going after a straw man, because I started right at the get-go in answering you. There's no way that I can prove the Bible is a word of God. You see, that's the basis of your whole argument. You better put your faith in Jesus Christ, because the historical evidence is that he is reliable. Nobody's going to go to heaven because they believe the Bible's a word of God. It's just not the issue. The issue is, who is Jesus Christ? Then, when you watch how Jesus treated the Old Testament as the word of God, because you experience his trustworthiness in your life, I'm convinced you'll come to view the Old Testament as a word of God. When you see how Jesus treats his own words, he says, heaven and earth will disappear. My words will never disappear. You begin to understand he viewed his own words as the word of God. But you only come to that point after you've experienced the trustworthiness of Christ in your life.
Even if Jesus endorses the Old Testament as it existed in the year, 30 AD, there has been 2,000 years since then for things to change, both for political reasons, just simple mistranslation. Even if we believe that Jesus Christ endorsed the Old Testament, that's a long time for things to get messed up.
Yeah, but we have the manuscripts that go back right to the time of Christ with the Old Testament, even before.
And there are additions to it.
No, sir. No, they're not. We have a tremendously reliable Hebrew Old Testament and Greek New Testament.
Yes, and as we can see that these testaments have changed over time. And even if we do have those old manuscripts, those aren't the one we use. We use New International Versions. We use
Yeah, but that's based on
King
the Greek.
James Version.
The New International Version is based on the Greek.